Getting Started with Equity in Gateway Courses, presented by Dr. Jeremiah J. Sims and Patty O'Sullivan. A new resource from Every Learner Everywhere Network, Getting Started with Equity, a guide for academic department leaders, introduces academic department leaders to the principles, strategies, and teaching practices of educational equity. Getting Started with Equity is a direct response to calls from department chairs and other academic leaders for practical advice in establishing classroom environments where students are empowered, encouraged, and equipped to succeed academically. So first, some background on the authors. Dr. Jeremiah J. Sims, inaugural Director of Equity for the College of San Mateo, was born in Oakland and raised in Richmond, California. Because of his own life experiences, Jeremiah has devoted his career to the realization of educational equity for hyper-marginalized students. Jeremiah is an alumnus of the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a BA in rhetoric with honors, as well as an MA and PhD in education. Jeremiah's work, chronicled in his first book, Revolutionary STEM Education, Critical Reality Pedagogy and Social Justice in STEM for Black Males, details his experience as an educator working toward a revolutionary paradigm shift in the STEM education of and for Black boys. His second book, Minding the Obligation Gap in Community Colleges, illuminates the role that community college practitioners must play in order to deconstruct the institutionalized inequities found in higher education. In two forthcoming books, The White Educator's Guide to Social Justice in Community Colleges and Towards Liberation, Anti-Racism and the Redesign of College Redesign, Sims works to demystify the pernicious relationship between racialized capitalism and white supremacy, and the role of this unholy union plays in pathologizing poor, hyper-marginalized BIPOC students, while arguing for committed educators to work towards an anti-racist growth mindset. Sims is also the editor of a Peter Lang book series, Educational Equity in Community Colleges. Patty O'Sullivan has worked in higher education since 2000 as an instructor, student advisor, faculty development specialist, instructor designer, and grant manager. She taught world religions at the University of Mississippi for 14 years and teaches health ethics in the School of Pharmacy. She holds a BA in communication from UMass Amherst, an MA in theology from Assumption College, and an MA in history from the University of Mississippi. She is currently the content manager at Every Learner Everywhere, where she works with network partners to develop, update, and curate text and video resources. Welcome, Patty and Dr. Sims.
Thank you, Blaine.
Yeah. So Patty, in your role as Every Learner content manager, please tell the audience a little more about your Getting Started with Equity guide.
Sure. But first, I want to apologize to the people in the chat for pulling Jeremiah away. You were really active there, and I was really enjoying reading what you wrote. So apologies to everyone, but you're going to get to hear Jeremiah speak, and that's even better. So yeah, thanks for the question, Blaine. So I work for Every Learner Everywhere. We are a network of 12 different partners who do advocacy and service work with universities, specifically to help students who are minoritized and students who are poverty affected attain a post-secondary degree. In my work at the University of Mississippi, we've started a Pathways to Equity initiative. And one thing that I was hearing in both of these jobs was that leaders and departments, department chairs, or even faculty, individual faculty members were going to diversity, equity, and inclusion events, training sessions, workshops, and walking away and saying, I still don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. Tell me what to do in my class. And so Jeremiah and I, along with two of our co-authors, Tia Holliday and Tynan Gable from Intentional Futures, we put together this guide. It's about 30 pages to help faculty and department chairs know specifically what are some of the things you can do. And you heard Rachel talk about this, and Catherine and Taz in the previous sessions. We break these down and we list them. That's part of the guide.
Great. Dr. Sims, can you tell me more about the why in Teaching for Equity? What is the research and what is the call to action? Can you hear me? We're having trouble hearing you. Maybe refresh? While we wait, feel free to go ahead and ask some questions in the Q&A that might come to mind.
Yeah, and I can even put in, I'm going to put in the chat, Blaine, some of the resources in the guide. So the guide there's a main guide, like I said, that has is about 30 pages long, and it starts with an overview, and then it goes into a departmental equity audit. It walks academic leaders how to audit your department in terms of teaching and learning, to find out where the equity problems might be. So we want to approach this like we're not just making assumptions about our students and what the problems might be with teaching and learning in our departments, but we really want to know. We want a data-informed way to approach these. And then the second part is those very specific teaching strategies. And then the third part are discipline-specific briefs. And so you heard Catherine and Rachel talk about how I had asked them to write briefs. We have briefs in psychology, chemistry, mathematics, biology. This is a living document. We are happy to have people write briefs for us. And so I just see in the chat, somebody asked who is qualified to conduct an equity audit. I'll get to that in a second. But if you're interested in writing an equity brief, I would be happy to hear from you. We want to continue to add to the briefs. We want to expand to be beyond these 5 disciplines and include as many as possible. Do we have Dr. Sims back yet?
Let me ask you another question while we wait for him to come back. What are some specific strategies for teaching, the teaching of equity? What are some main themes of these strategies, and what are some examples faculty can implement right now?
Sure. So again, in the previous session, I think Dr. Daniels did a really great job of outlining what she saw as 5 themes or 5 facets of teaching for inclusion. We break ours down into 4. We talk specifically about classroom climate. We talk about course design. We talk about representation in the curriculum and in the classroom. And then we also talk about actual teaching and assessment strategies. So for classroom climate, the other presenters did a really good job of talking about the research behind this, but creating a welcoming space for students, letting students know that they belong in your class. I'll never forget, so I did a bunch of, I did 16 focus groups with students at the University of Mississippi, and that's really informed some of this work. But I'll never forget one student saying to me that he started a STEM class. There was maybe 400 people in it. And on the first day, the first thing the professor said to them was, "Half of you will fail." And it was just the most discouraging thing he heard. You know, he had plans to pursue a particular professional path and to be a first-year student, and here, you know, in your first class, your first STEM class, your professor just setting up the expectation that you're going to fail. He called it an academic hazing ritual. And that's always really kind of stuck with me. So that sense of belonging, helping students feel like you do belong here, and you are not an imposter. You've earned your seat here. And the other part of that is, I'm here to help you. I'm not here to be a gatekeeper. I'm not here to weed you out. I want you to be in this class. I want you to be in this discipline. I want you to be a practitioner in the field alongside me someday. That's really important. So that's a specific practice that doesn't cost anything, right? You don't have to revise your whole course to on your first day kind of send those messages to students. For course design, we focus a lot on cognitive load, reducing cognitive load. And so what we mean by that is that we want students to spend their intellectual energy learning the content of your class, not trying to figure out what your expectations are, not trying to figure out how to use the technology in your class, not trying to figure out how to access certain things, when things are due. So the more clarity you can give students, the more organized your class is, the more consistency there is in the design of the course, the less cognitive load there is for students, and the more time they can spend actually learning the actual content in your class. Like Taz said, really focusing on the learning objectives. We don't want students to fail our class because of some technical difficulty, or something that's outside of the learning objectives. The only reason students should be not succeeding in our classes is because they didn't attain the learning objectives. It shouldn't be all that extraneous stuff that has to do with your course design. The third bucket that we have is representation. And again, the others talked about this beautifully, particularly in the first session where Rachel and Catherine talked about linguistic racism. And that's just one piece of it, letting students bring their own identities to the classroom. Taz talked about having an asset-minded or growth mindset approach to students rather than a deficit-minded approach. But representation takes on so many different levels, right? It's not just the content of your course shouldn't just reflect a single demographic. In examples, people should be able to see, if you have case studies or examples for on tests and things like that, those should be representative of your students. And then also in the classroom, notice who's talking. Who's doing all of the talking? Are you calling mainly on one demographic over the others? Do students feel comfortable speaking their minds? Do they feel comfortable asking questions? So that's all part of representation as well. And then the last bucket that we have is teaching and assessment strategies that particularly benefit minoritized and poverty impacted students. And there are a lot of these. Some of them seem to overlap with some of the things that we just said, but one that Taz mentioned, and I think is really important, is allowing students to learn from each other. One thing that I've noticed, and I have a particular story to tell about this. My son was taking a computer science class. He found the coding really hard. He had friends in his esports team who were also in the class, and they would talk about, what did you get? How did you put this together, and how did you create this code? In their minds, they were learning together, but the instructor thought they were cheating and told them they weren't allowed to talk to each other. And so they went through well, who can we talk to? Other than you, who can we talk to? Can we talk to our mentor our faculty mentor in the esports team? Can we talk to tutors? It's just the isolating students and making them learn on their own. It's just not a good teaching practice. So that's just a brief example. I see that we have Dr. Sims back, so I'm going to hand it over to him.
All right, so you can hear me now, yes?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome back.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know what was going on there. I was wondering why ASU had so many tech checks before this conversation. Now I see why. I apologize. Thank you all for your grace. So the question was, why equity?
Yes. So can you tell me more about the why of teaching equity? What is the research and what is the call to action?
Okay, so the thing is there's no middle ground, right? There's no liminal space. You're either teaching for equity, right? You're teaching for justice, or you are further pathologizing and penalizing poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. So there are some people who feel as though they can sit on the proverbial fence, but the problem with the fence is this. When people are sitting on the fence, they're necessarily fortifying the weight of the fence, right? So I have to be very clear about this, right? For all the folks here, all the wonderful folks here, if you are not teaching for justice, you are teaching for injustice. There is no middle ground. Like we had this conversation, one of the ways to frame it, in California, we're moving towards, in many places, ethnic studies requirement, right? And there are some people who are up in arms about that. They were like, well, why do we need an ethnic studies requirement? It's going to inculcate and indoctrinate certain people, right, who see the world differently. But the reality is, in that space, there's no middle ground either. There's already an ethnic studies curriculum being taught. It's just a Eurocentric, white supremacist ethnic studies curriculum, right? So if we don't have a curricula that interrogates and disrupts that, right, then we're stuck. But there's already an ethnic studies curriculum. It's just studying whiteness, right? And by virtue of espousing the kind of grandeur of whiteness is necessarily denigrating all non-whiteness. And so that's why these type of conversations are important. So you teach for equity, you teach for justice, or you're teaching for injustice. If you sit on the fence, you're fortifying the weight of the fence, making it that much more difficult to move, right? And there was a question somebody asked. I saw a meme and said, what can I do to be an ally? For some educators, the only thing you can do to be an ally is to retire, right? And so we have to be very clear. You either get off the fence or you get out the way. Because as long as you're on the fence, as long as you're not so clear about what needs to happen next, then you're making the work more difficult for people who are working in solidarity with our students. And I love all y'all. I want to be clear about that. But what I'm saying to you now is the truth. If you can't figure out how to contribute to this work in a meaningful way, then you got to get out of the way because you're an obstacle. So that's why we need to teach for equity. There's no other way.
Throughout the guide, you refer to gateway courses. Can you explain what a gateway course is?
Yeah, so I think about, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. So I think about Yuri Treisman's work. I don't know if y'all familiar with his work. Some years ago now in the 80s, he looked at a gateway course for medical, for students that wanted to go on to pursue medical doctors. They wanted to be physicians. And so he was looking at organic chemistry, if my memory serves. And what he found to be the case is that, so he looked at Asian American students, European American students, and African American or Black students. And the Black students were getting the lowest grades in the class, right? And so on paper, the students that he looked at, there should be some similarity with regard to ability insofar as standardized testing scores can demonstrate that, right? And so the reason that he found, and so this course was incredibly important if you wanted to go on to pursue. If you couldn't get through this course, the medical school was no longer a reality for you, right? And so what he found to be the case in doing this work, right, and this is something off tangent, but I'll bring it back, is that when Black students were encouraged to work in groups, because the problem was Black students, there were so few of them, and they felt like they weren't invited, they weren't included into the spaces, that it wasn't easy for them to join mixed ethno-racial identity study groups. There's only so much studying you can do as a full-time student in UC Berkeley, right? And so what they would do is they would do as much work as they could do with the time that they had, but that almost always limited them to studying the arithmetic, right? The answers that they could check at the back of the book. But in order to be successful in chemistry, right, organic chemistry, you have to understand the conceptual knowledge too. And so they never got to that point because there's only so many hours in a day, right? So for the Asian American group, studying was part and parcel of their experience together as friends. And then for the European American group, they studied much more than African American group. Ultimately, what happened in this course is that once the Black students were encouraged to work together in groups, their grades were on par with everybody else, right? So what that demonstrated is that it's not about rigor, right? Going back to James's point, some other points, it's not about the rigor. The course wasn't too rigorous for them. There wasn't some intrinsic kind of lack of ability with Black students, right? But the reality is the course necessitated a certain type of study modality in order to be successful. You need to be able to study the arithmetic, right? The things that you can check in the back of the book, while also wrestling with the conceptual knowledge necessary to be successful. And so oftentimes gateway courses are, especially in STEM, gateway courses are sifting mechanisms. They're othering mechanisms, right? That serve racialized capitalism, right? Because racialized capitalism, real quick, the way that it works is, right, all capitalism is racialized anyway. Let's be clear about that. But racialized capitalism works to identify sites of surplus value extraction, okay? Those sites are actual people, right? And so white supremacy is necessary to justify capitalism, right? So what happens is that it sifts people right? Because these are the people that capital can be accrued from their corporeal bodies, and these are the people that are going to accrue that capital. And so gateway courses determine who gets to be the people who accrue capital, and who gets to be the people for whom capital is extracted from. And I know that that's kind of a kind of meta conversation, but that's the way that it makes sense to me.
Thank you. Just a reminder to the audience, please ask your questions in the Q&A tab. I have another question. So you make the point in the guide of saying that equity needs to be a communal effort rather than an individual effort. Can you explain why?
I'll start with this, Jeremiah, and then you can pick it up. But we very intentionally wrote this guide for academic leaders, department chairs, deans, because one of the things that we didn't want to do is make it seem like this is a lift that individuals have to do. Equity is systematic, and the only way you can change systems is through a communal effort. An individual faculty member cannot change the systems that create certain policies in departments or certain policies at a university that prevent students from succeeding. So that's one aspect of it. But also we just want to normalize it. The only way to normalize teaching with equity is to bake it into everything that we do, all of our faculty development programming, bake it into every course revision, and it needs to be supported by the top at institutions. It needs to come from the provost's office. It needs to come from the deans and the chairs. So it's great when individuals are champions, and I want to celebrate those people, but we can't leave them out on their own. We need to normalize equity by making the expectation that all faculty should be doing this. Not like Jeremiah said, you can't be sitting on the fence. So this is something that departments need to engage in together and having conversations about what are the things that we can change, not just in our own teaching, but in the department, in the program, in the experience of getting a post-secondary certificate or degree in this major. What can we do as a group to make that happen? Jeremiah?
Yeah. Agreed. All right, because these are systemic problems, right? They're systematic, but they're also systemic. And so, right, individual actors cannot undo the entirety of this kind of macro structural inequity, right? They can do their part. Everybody has a part to play. We want to be very clear about that, right? We are celebrating you equity champions, and those of you who are working to create spaces for students to realize their fullest human potential in your classes. We applaud you. I applaud you. I salute you. Continue to do that work, irrespective of what's going on at the institutional level. At the same time, we need to hold our institutions accountable, right? So I had a conversation with my college. I'm the director of equity at my college, right? And so I want to be very clear, right, for those who are in leadership roles and even folks who are not necessarily in leadership roles, we still need to be able to have these conversations. Every college, every institution has a mission statement, right? It has a list of visions and goals, right? I don't care what that says. I care what the budget says. Your budget, your college's budget is your mission statement. Your college's budget is your visions and goals. If there's not equitable resource allocation, if the system is not prioritizing equity and justice, right, then we're lying about who we are. I read an amazing book called Begin Again by Eddie S. Glaude Jr., and he talks about a value gap. So this country is predicated on a value gap, right, that holds that white lives are more valuable than non-white lives, right? And so until we're honest about that value gap, right, we're going to continue to do things to cover our lies, right? Because the issues that we've seen come to the fore in 2020 are not new issues around racial reckoning, right? That is part and parcel of who we are as a country, right? This democratic experiment has always been Eurocentric, has always privileged capitalism and white supremacy. So we need to be clear about those things. And so we have to demand that resource allocation be justice-centered and equity advancing. Because if we don't, we're kicking against the goad. We're fighting a system and trying to work in spite of the system instead of working in solidarity with the system. So I think it's very important in your spaces. I know, man, if you don't have tenure, it's a hard conversation to have. I get that. But as much as you're able to have these types of conversations, you need to hold the college accountable, hold your institution accountable. Because it doesn't matter what you write down for a mission statement. It matters how you allocate resources and whether or not that allocation is commensurate with the statement that you made.
You round out the guide with a glossary of terms in which you write, quote, "We particularly struggle with terms around race, which can be too vague, too specific, too outdated, too trendy, too exclusive, too inclusive, too complex, and too simple." Can you explain more about the struggle with terms having to do with race?
I'm going to let Dr. Sims take this, but I will just say that we did struggle a lot in the guide with language. And there's very good reasons why. So we try to explain in the glossary what we mean when we say certain words, why we're using certain words over other words. I mean, one thing that if you've been paying attention to this work, you know that the terms have changed a lot and they change quickly. And sometimes it's really easy to feel like you're behind the eight ball. You don't know what words to use anymore. And that can be really frustrating for people. And so it's really not about the words, it's about the actions behind the words, but the words do matter. What we said in the guide was, we just commit to calling people by the terms they want to be referred to as. That's something that we need to start doing. And so even though some of us may be uncomfortable, particularly white people, what do I call you? That discomfort is my problem. It's not the problem of the people I'm trying to describe. Jeremiah, do you want to pick up on why talking about race and racial terms is so hard?
Yeah, so I have to be honest, talking about race and racial terms is not hard for me. And I understand that it is hard for folks because we're worried about whether or not we're going to say something wrong, right? And so I would encourage, so real learning, right? And Dr. Daniels was talking about learning too, right? The way learning works is that you meet a certain threshold and you struggle to overcome that threshold, right? And then once you achieve that, in the middle of where you ran into that obstacle and where you surpassed, that's where learning takes place. And so that's why I created a term, anti-racist growth mindset, right? So we talked a little bit, Dr. Daniels talked about growth mindset, right? And so growth mindset is in contradistinction to a fixed mindset. And I can't think of anything that epitomizes a fixed mindset more than a racist mindset, because you're essentializing people based on their phenotypical characteristics, right? And so the idea behind the anti-racist growth mindset is that irrespective of where you are right now, right, in this country on June 10th, you can develop an anti-racist growth mindset. A lot of this is predicated on Dweck's work, also Joe Bowler from Stanford, Professor Joe Bowler's work. And she talks about how every time, just real quick, she talked about a study, right? The study was dealt with taxi cab drivers, right? So these guys were middle-aged taxi cab drivers. They wanted to drive for the Black London Taxi Cab Company, which is the most prestigious taxi cab company in London. They had to take a test. This test took an average of 12 attempts to complete, and it took about 4 years for them to study for the test. Right, they had to remember about 130,000 streets and avenues because they can't use GPS because they're the cream of the crop. So while these middle-aged men were studying for this test, their hippocampus actually grew. Right, they used magnetic resonance imaging, and they could see that there was so much activity there that it physically grew, which meant that they were developing new neural pathways, right, and new synaptic connections. All these things were taking place for these middle-aged men, right? Because after they retired, then it went back to its normal size. Right. So what does that mean for what I'm talking about? It means that we can learn anything we want to if we're willing to invest in learning it. And so my argument in this other book, Towards Liberation, that's coming out, I don't know when it's coming out. It's coming out sooner than later. Is that anyone, irrespective of where you are, if you're willing to do the work, right? This is self-critical, reflective work. If you're willing to do it, understanding that you're going to make some mistakes, and mistakes are awesome because they help you grow, you can develop an anti-racist growth mindset so that your analytical frame will be predicated on anti-racism, not non-racist, right? But anti-racist, so that you can then identify racist policies, practices, procedures, and pedagogies and begin to call them out and begin to do something about it. And so I'm saying all this to say that we don't have to continue to be intimidated by the terminology. We want to do our best to do it right, but you can grow. We know this. We know that the human brain can make, right, well into your 50s and 60s and 70s, you can make new neural connections. So if you want to do the work, you can do the work. Do not preclude yourself from going forward in this. If you want to develop an anti-racist growth mindset, you can do it. It's inevitable that you will develop it if you begin the necessary self-critical, reflexive work around justice and equity. And so I just wanted to encourage you all, and I wanted to share that. Yeah, these terms are hard, right? And they do change over time. Language is incredibly important, right? The Bible says that the power of life and death is in the tongue, right? So this is very, very important. I'm not being dismissive about that. At the same time, struggle is good because it means that you're creating opportunities to learn, and that learning, right, will continue to move you towards your goals of developing an anti-racist growth mindset. And I truly believe that for everybody who is tuned in here.
Yeah, I will just add that one
Our
of the
last
things
question,
that we did right in the guide around. Oh, sorry, Blaine. I was just going to follow up that one of the things that we mentioned in the guide around our glossary was that, we're trying to describe something that's a social construct. It's legally very real. It's socially and economically very real. But at the end of the day, it's something that we've constructed, race. And so that's why it's so hard to when you define something, you're trying to capture it. And it's hard to capture something that we've created. Sorry, Blaine, go ahead with your last question.
Sure. So just really quickly, one question was, when you look at what happened with UNC and Nikole Hannah-Jones, does the idea of addressing issues challenging the general narrative create such jeopardy that it's easier to not rock the boat? And there were a couple other questions about contingency faculty. So if you could just quickly address that question.
There's a really great theory by Paul, I'm going to say his last name wrong, I believe it's Glossary, called Pacing for Privilege. And what he talks about is this idea that institutions, any organization really, it doesn't have to be higher ed, will prioritize the discomfort, the feelings of the people least invested in progress over the people who are being affected every day in really significant ways by lack of progress. So to say that, I understand, I was an adjunct for 14 years. There are certain things, I've censored myself. But at the same time, the work is too important to stay in our comfort zone. If I think this UNC hiring dispute, it's become a national conversation, and so I'm really glad that Nikole Hannah-Jones is fighting back, and that we're going to continue to talk about this. I wouldn't like to see anyone fired or not hired because they spoke out, but at the same time, the more we normalize speaking out, then the harder it is to justify penalizing people, penalizing academics, particularly for saying these things.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, they did this to Cornell
It
West.
looks like we're out of time today. Yeah. I'm so sorry. We're out of time for this session. I'd really like to thank Dr. Sims and Patty for joining us today and sharing information from this valuable resource. We're taking a break so you can explore the event. Please be sure to check out our partner hall to access valuable resources and engage with sponsors, as well as the networking lounge to mix and mingle with attendees. We encourage your participation in the themed networking chats that align with today's topic.